Is this thing on? Good morning. I've said it every day. It's like a moving line. I got to restart my computer because it glitches the first 5 seconds when I hit the live button on YouTube. But here I am, waiting for the glitch, drinking the coffee. So good. Good morning, Jenny. We're talking vintage today. What's up, OG in the house? I'm going to talk a little vintage. What's up, George? Good evening to you. Ken is here. What's up? OG came in off the grid for restocks and supplies. Speaking of supplies, I put my order in for penny sleeves. Now, I have an account with BCW, but their penny sleeves are back ordered like a year. So I've got to find my penny sleeves. And penny sleeves are actually, you can find cheap penny sleeves. And by the way, you can find cheap top loaders as well in stock with no back orders. Go to Columbia Hobby. This is not a plug. I don't get anything from them, so I won't post their link. But just Google Columbia Hobby. I put an order for 2 cases of penny sleeves. 20,000 penny sleeves coming my way. Since I bought 2 cases, I got that price down to basically a half a penny. So they're half penny. They're half a penny sleeves. Their top loader prices are around 8 cents, I think, per top loader. And if you buy in bulk, I think you can get that price down to 7 cents per top loader, which is really good because at one point in time, if you could find them for brand new top loaders, you were paying almost 20 cents per top loader. Every Thursday, Monday, and I know Friday, but it's Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday that confuse me. Zach, good morning. Dan is with us. Let's see, dude, I have boxes upon boxes of penis sleeves at the moment. Ken bought the sleeves from Target this weekend. My stores haven't been stocking the penny sleeves. I've been hitting Walmart and Target every week lately to find those because when you buy them, those 1,000 count packs, I think they come out to be just over a penny after tax. Comes out to like 1.3 cents per penny sleeve. So it's still a good deal. If you go to like a card shop, like I haven't been to my local card shop in almost a year. It kind of sucks. And he raised the prices at one time you could get 6 packs of 100 for $5. And then all of a sudden he raised it to $2 a pack. And I said, I'm out. And actually between the $2 penny sleeves and the mountain of retail that he would buy off flippers, it's like, you know what, I'm out. And I get it. Some local card shops don't buy enough product, so they were left in the cold when it came to allocation. But when you're buying, like when you can still buy some of this stuff on the shelf at Target and he's buying, like, what kind of business move is that? You're paying a flipper, you're paying secondary prices and then marking it up when you can just go to Target. And I think it was like UFC. A friend of mine was in the shop and said he's got a bunch of UFC Chronicles for $60 a blaster when you can literally go 3 blocks to the Target and they're in stock. So I haven't been going down there to my card shop. Be a hot door, nice. Glitchy. Yep, I think I'm gonna have to restart the computer today. Even on my phone instead of laptop, it's super glitchy. Yeah, I think it's glitchy for everyone today. George said I'm still awake. GoFundMe to get both. So I actually got one of my friends, like an IT guy, and he said a Wi-Fi extender would not work for me based on my configuration. Like he's a Wi-Fi internet guru, and the is it the router, the modem? I don't know. We moved it. I'm connection unstable again. I'm not sure what's going on. Let's see. Only thing vintage tonight is Bo's dial-up connection. Yeah, I'm completely frozen. I may not even get into the vintage talk because it's being really crappy today. So OG's out. So last night, last night. We finished Reacher, and I bought Zach. I bought the second book, and I think it's going to come today, so I can dive into. It's kind of worked out perfect because I finished the book, The Killing Floor, just a couple weeks ago, and then the series came out on Amazon um, last week. So we watched the finale last night. I really liked it. I thought they did well. So I'm gonna read the series. I've been looking for books. I've been looking for books, and it's like, hey, I'll just read this series. So yeah, book 2 is on the way. Should be delivered today. Thank you, Amazon Prime. Um, Also being delivered today, hopefully, my EW boxes from David, from Dak T-Mac fan, hooked me up. He didn't want to open his that he found out in the wild, so I bought them, and I think they're going to be on my doorstep later today. So I'll probably do a rip. We'll see how my internet's doing. May do a live rip later today, later tonight on AEW Upper Deck. Hey, be a good lead-in, AEW on TBS. So maybe I'll do a live break right before AEW goes on the air, and then I'll just do 2 breaks on my own pace during the show. So I don't know, has the glitchiness subsided a little bit? It might just be my computer trying to wake up because I wasn't. It's kind of like on sleep mode. So hopefully it's doing better. But it definitely needs a restart because it's glitchy for me. I don't know if it's glitchy for you at the start, but it's glitchy for me when I hit the live button. Turkey Cards, what's up? Close the app and reopen. Working for now. Knock on wood. You're good. Okay, sounds good. So I want to talk vintage because this is like the great debate in baseball cards, and you know it's finding an era in what you call vintage. There's no wrong. There's not a wrong. What you can is not wrong. But by saying vintage can only be this set, there's some people I've seen on Twitter that just scream to the clouds that vintage is this and it can't be anything else. That's wrong. But what's not wrong, if you don't consider 80s vintage, that's okay because to you, it's not vintage. I don't consider 80s vintage because that's when the era I grew up. But the harsh reality is 1987 tops, those beautiful wood grain borders, came out 35 years ago. And I know a lot of us were collecting 1987 tops cards as kids. And we cannot grasp or accept the fact. In reality, think about it. 35 years ago was 1987 tops. 35 years from 1987 was what, 1952? Think about that. We are the same distance from 1987 as we were from 1952 and 1987. Was 1952 tops vintage in 1987? It sure was. And there's people that are the generation ahead of us, the older generation that grew up collecting 1952 to 1987, couldn't accept the fact that the 1950s were vintage, but it was to some, not to them, but to us. And now to others, the younger generation, 1987 is vintage. And I brought this topic up because Ivan at Watch the Breaks on Twitter tweeted out a picture of the 1986 Fleer Michael Jordan. Is this vintage? And I gave my opinion. Vintage is a moving line. The word vintage wasn't adopted in 1980 or 1990. The word vintage has been around for centuries. So who is to say that we can only in baseball cards, wave our magic wand and say, I hereby declare vintage baseball cards can only be 1952 to 1979. We can't do that. It's a moving number because what happens when we all die? Uh, the word vintage is still going to be around. The definition is going to remain the same in 100 years when we're all gone. Um, and there's going to be vintage. Someday the cards that are going to be released next week by Topps 2022 Series One Topps, those are going to be vintage someday. They haven't even been released, but they will be vintage someday. It's a moving line. We cannot accept the fact that 1980s cards are vintage, and that's okay because they are not vintage to us, but they are vintage to others. And I shared this story the Madison Card Show last week. I had a young guy, 20 years old probably, came up to my and I've got the dollar boxes and the 25-cent boxes. 1980 and back. That's what I consider vintage when it and basically all sport. I my definition, my personal definition of vintage trading cards is basically 1980 and back because really 1970 and back, but I consider early 70s vintage. But like 76, I it's kind of like I was born in 1982 and we're like a micro generation. They consider us like the micro generation, and there's words for it because we can't settle on one definition of our little micro generation. And it's basically like 1980 to 1984, 1977. It's kind of it's not a defined, little era, but it's a micro generation because we don't fit into Generation X because we're too young for Generation X, but we're too old to be considered a millennial. And, I think by definition, millennials, like 1982 to 83 is kind of where they start the millennials. And I don't, we and I can speak for myself on this, but I don't really identify with either generation. Like I do be a millennial, but I do feel too young to be a Gen Xer. So and I kind of feel the same with baseball cards and football cards and basketball cards, where that 1906 to 1983 is kind of a micro generation because I don't have a word for that era of trading cards because it's not because we basically go from vintage to overproduced slash junk wax era. My apologies, Zach. But 1976 to 1983 doesn't fall into either of those categories for me personally. I don't consider the late 70s, early 80s vintage, but I also don't, factually, they are not part of the overproduction once we got into the mid 80s. And, I think that line it's kind of a blur. We don't really know the production numbers. But there's a lot of speculation. So that's kind of where I set my line to vintage. So back to my Madison Card Show story. The younger collector approaches my table and he asks, "Do you have any vintage basketball?" And I said no, because to me, vintage basketball predates 1980. And my probably earliest basketball in these boxes is like 80. And there might actually be some late 70s, early 80s. I think I actually have some of the 80 Topps, 80, 81 Topps bat where they're perforated, and I've got like a whole stack that were separated. So I've got those in like my quarter box because they're all separated. They're not complete. So got the hiccups. So I no, I don't have any vintage basketball. So he actually comes back. He comes back around about an hour later, and he's like, "Hey, do you have any vintage basketball?" He's like, "Oh, I already asked you." And he looks over, and somebody was digging through one of my basketball quarter boxes, digging through like he had a pile of 90s basketball, which is definitely not vintage in my eyes. And he said, "Oh yeah, you've got 90s basketball. That's what I'm looking for." So to him, the 1990s basketball was vintage, but to me, I would never consider the 90s to be vintage. But it's all in the eye of the beholder. And if you don't consider 80s or 90s vintage, that's fine. You, it's not vintage, but to somebody else, to a younger generation, they do consider 80s and 90s vintage, and that's also okay. I'm going to go to the chat because I went on a long spiel. Let's see. OG's back and sounds good. That's good to hear. Turkey cards yesterday. The old bartender called me sir. I guess I'm vintage now. Yeah, you are vintage. To her, to them, yeah, absolutely. My doctor told me I'm vintage after my yearly checkup last week. I agree. I can say that and I will. I like ultra modern, classic, vintage, pre-war tobacco. That's kind of, I mean, for me, and we can use those terms. Like you can individually use those terms, but those terms aren't going to fit every collector. Um, and those numbers are always those definitions are always going to move because ultra modern right now is not going to be ultra modern in 10 years. So it's an ever evolving, moving uh, definition for each of us. And for you personally, you can use those definitions and set your years, but it's not going to be an end all be all. Those years and those definitions, those years for those definitions are always going to change based on the person. I pre-war and tobacco, that's a different story. That's, ultra modern, vintage. Those are like generic definitions. Pre-war and tobacco is more specific. We can decades, 1980s, it's always going to be 1980s. That's not an evolving, we know what 1980s cards are going to be, what 1990s cards are going to be. Tobacco cards, we know, unless they start sticking small pictures of baseball players in packs of cigarettes again, they're not. We can consider tobacco to be the 1800s and early 1900s. Diego says we just can't accept getting older. That's a fact for me personally. Absolutely, it's hard to accept. I was watching my wife went out with a girlfriend to dinner last night, which was perfect because I had a great doubleheader of Big Ten basketball. Wisconsin, Michigan State, Badgers win. I should have wore my Badgers in celebration, and then followed by Illinois and Purdue, and Purdue won. Which yesterday I talked about how I didn't like Purdue, but I root for Illinois. I was actually rooting for Purdue last night because that created a three-way tie for first place since the Badgers beat Michigan State. They're now 10-3. The Illini 10-2. They lost, so 10-3, and then Purdue's win put them from 9-3 to 10-3. So three-way tie. Anyway, wife comes home. We're watching. I'm like, oh, that kid mentioned this. I've got a friend's whose son is on the Illini, and I'm like, that kid on the far bench. He doesn't play, but I'm friends with his parents. The wife goes, we're old. we've got friends with kids, and it's hard to swallow that pill. Can you imagine when we were kids? Say I have 20-year-old. When I was a kid, in the old and vintage, and that's all in our mind. We kind of have this weird mindset as we age. In the early 90s, when I was 10 years old in 1992, I thought 1987 Topps, those wood grain, I thought that was vintage. Like when I was 10, because it was before I collected. I didn't really start. Like I remember having opening packs of cards in 88. I remember the 86 Topps football. I didn't open packs. I was only 4, but I think I had an older cousin, some Jim McMahon cards and all that. But I thought 87 was vintage in the early 90s, and it was only 5 years old. But to me, when you're 10, that's half your lifetime. So it does change. Zach brings up the oldies radio changes as people age. End of story. And it does. And that's what I talked, and that's another can of worms. Oldies stations and I remember growing up in the 80s. My mom always listening to the oldies because that's the music she grew up on. Music from the 50s and 60s. And think about that. That was only 20 to 30 years ago. from the 80s. An oldie station, that would be the same as an oldies station. An oldies station today playing music from the 90s and early 2000s. So it's when you start thinking about it in that perspective, it's like, oh, whoa. George says, speak for yourself, Diego. I embrace the peace of mind knowing that I'm getting closer to not retiring. Jenny says, vintage doesn't mean valuable. Some seem to think that. Yeah, there's a big misconception with old meaning worth a lot, or rare meaning worth a lot. Sometimes rare just means nobody wants it, so it's not valuable. Heck, soon year 2000 clothing will be vintage, if not already. Like when I look back at pictures of me in high school and college, I'm thinking, oh man, and some of those styles are coming back. Um, it's wild, and that's why they won't call the 80s vintage, because it's value. Collector license plates are a rolling time. Doesn't mean the newest version of the collectible car cutoff is as valuable as the Model T. What's up, Jeremy? Good morning. Pre-Fanatics era. There you go. The Topps era. Although I guess you can't say Topps era because the Topps era continues. Wood grain with the leather seats. Windows so dark you need a flashlight to see me smoking on that dozer. Starter jackets. Yeah, like starter jackets, I would say, are vintage. Isn't that funny how we consider different things from the same era, vintage or not vintage? Like a 1994 Topps baseball card is not vintage. 1994 starter jacket, that's vintage. Isn't that weird? That's how I think. There's others that probably don't consider a piece of clothing from the 90s to be vintage, but I would consider that to be vintage. It's just weird. And there's no wrong way to think, as long as you don't like strike your fist on the table and say vintage is only this era and it can be no other era. Like that's crazy talk. But to us, it be the case. But it doesn't mean it's the case for others. So I just want words out, hear myself talk. What I think of vintage. Personally, what I think of vintage, my eras. So here's what I think, and it's kind of along the lines of, was it Fall Creek? Yeah, I'm kind of I kind of use the same terms that Fall uses. Ultra modern for the last couple years, and that's going to be, today, 2021 and 2022 are ultra modern, but in 5 years, it's going to be 2025 and 2026, and those ultra modern cards are going to be more modern cards. Modern is just kind of, again, it's, I don't really know what I can specifically say. I consider basically pre-war. I consider anything before World War II, and I know some people say World War I. I say World War II. So anything 40s, early 40s and back, or 30s and back, 1939, before the war actually started, late 30s or whenever. That's kind of what I consider pre-war, pre-World War II. And then vintage. My vintage definition would be gone, and we didn't have too many baseball card 40s. So basically 1952 to like 1975, micro generation of cards where 80s and early 80s, like it doesn't fit into, for me personally, vintage, but it also doesn't fit into like the junk wax era, which is a term I use for the mid 80s into the mid to late 90s. So I guess maybe 70, maybe maybe the vintage cutoff is 69, and then I just start using decades, 70s, 80s, 90s. And then, modern is the 2000s, and ultra modern is, the last, I think ultra modern maybe the last 2 to 3 years. Because when you think about it, like Bowman, like the Bowman in 2018, 2019, those players are now starting to reach rookie status. by and large. Um, and usually it's that 3-year mark for the Heritage Miners, the Bowman. It's 3 years, and that's kind of like the pinnacle of collectability for those prospect cards, because now we're really, they're making their push to the big leagues. My connection is unstable on my end, so I apologize if I'm glitchy. I'm just going to end it. Kind of getting tired of this crappy internet this morning. I just got Boda Slow Rap. You like it? Oh, I someone that would smack their first and argue like that. He has a podcast. You probably know him. I think I know who you're talking about. Let's see. He gave so yeah. So I don't know if my connection is unstable or not. I'm getting that message. So that's about all I had for today. Big shipping day. I yesterday, just my eBay store update. Yesterday I listed over 300 items. I think I did 300 on Monday. Wanted to get over the weekend. I dropped into like the 9 listings, so I really wanted to push to get over 10,000. A little over 10,400 by last, because as I was watching basketball, I was just on the couch listing. I did file exchange yesterday afternoon. Did make a bunch of sales, and I want to make a big push on Tuesdays, because if you use standard envelopes, the postage fees are taken from your account on Wednesdays. So I see those numbers, and it's kind of I have mixed feelings about that, because it's good because it's good because you basically get like eBay floats you the money for postage for a week or more. But then it all comes out at one time, and it's like boom, 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 drop, 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 drop. So I want to make sales, sales, sales to keep those numbers from falling so fast. So that's why I wanted to list so many cards on Tuesday, was to get ahead of the big draw of standard envelope fees that will be taken from my account today. So today's going to be a big shipping day. And maybe I'll get to more. I listed this week. A lot of this has been the Goodwill singles, so a lot of those are in my eBay store. Let's see. File exchange is super confusing. Have you followed my instructions? It's changed a little bit from I posted that blog article. Have you followed the instructions? It's only super confusing when you get started. But once you get your template, and I have the template on my website that you can use, you may have to tailor it, because I do free shipping. I have my handling to like 3 or 4 days. People want less on the handling. But I do that just because I'm doing so much volume. It gives me a cushion. But it's actually, once you get it, it can be very frustrating at first. But once you get it set up and do a couple test runs, just put in like two items and test them out. And then once you get it going and you figure out, and then you start streaming, and it's kind of been the streamlining process for me. It's been a lot of crowdsourcing. Like Chris is the one that sent me the template, and then I tweaked it to what I wanted. And yeah, it took me quite a few turns to get it right. And it was very frustrating at the beginning, but once I did get it, I can't praise it enough. I can list the most I've done in one sitting and that's if I have everything. I don't have to look at comps, and I have everything ready to go using my scanner and all the uploading. I did 125 in 1 hour. So it can be an invaluable tool. And then I think it was Andrew who's like, hey, do this, scan the cards, copy them all over into Exchange, 1 page at a time, so 28 images, and then get the cards sorted so you can bulk copy and paste into the spreadsheet. And that like probably cut my time in half. So just basic crowdsourcing to get it streamlined to the point where you can get over 100 in 1 hour listed. So it's awesome. So that's what I had for today. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great Wednesday, and we'll chat tomorrow.